The flashing lights were the first thing I noticed. Started like any other music class, the hum of students chatting, the slight tapping of a pencil against a notebook. Miss Blackwood, the substitute teacher, was at the front of the room talking about some boring theory on composers, but I wasn't listening. I could feel it building like an electric current, prickling through my fingers, crawling up my arm. The tingling had started before, but not like this. I'd been seizure-free for 3 months, but something about the way my fingers felt, so cold, so numb, told me this was going to be different. I needed to get to the nurse, fast. I could feel the pressure in my head like it was going to explode. My body was about to betray me again, and I didn't want anyone to see it. I'd gotten good at hiding it, but sometimes, like now, it was too strong to ignore. Miss Blackwood, I called out, my voice shaky but trying to stay calm. I need to go to the nurse. I'm about to have a seizure. She glanced at me, her face expressionless, like she hadn't even heard me. The whole class seemed to go still, the air growing thick with tension as I tried to control my breathing, fighting to stay conscious. I knew I had about 2 minutes before I would lose everything, control, consciousness, my body, and I needed help. Fast. But instead of helping, Miss Blackwood rolled her eyes. Oh, please, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Every kid suddenly has epilepsy now, it's trendy. Her words felt like a slap to the face, cold and cruel. But the worst part wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Like my condition, my life didn't matter, like it was some sort of joke. The tingling spread up my arm, now reaching my shoulder, my chest, my brain, and I could feel myself losing the battle. I'm not faking, I said, my voice breaking. Please, I need help. But Miss Blackwood didn't move, she didn't even look concerned, she didn't understand, no one did. The lights above us flickered, just a quick flash, then another and another. In a panic, I felt like they were blinking just for me, trying to tear me apart from the inside. My vision blurred, the edges of everything warping like I was drowning in a dream. It wasn't just my body reacting anymore, it was my mind spiraling into panic. I could hear people whispering around me, but they were too far away, like I was underwater, muffled voices in the distance. Then I felt my closest friend jump to her feet, her eyes wide with fear. She's not faking, shouted, moving toward the door. I've seen her seizures before, Miss Blackwood, stop, she needs help. But Miss Blackwood didn't listen. Instead, she blocked, a cruel, unreadable look on her face. The only thing seizing here is her need for attention, she snapped. It hit me like a punch in the stomach. Was this really happening? Was no one going to do anything? The strobe lights kept flashing, and it felt like my brain was being zapped piece by piece. David, another student in the class, stood up from his seat and collapsed. His body stiffened just like mine. David? Someone screamed, and panic flooded the room. He was having a seizure too, but Miss Blackwood, she still didn't move. She just stood there calm as could be, watching. And she did something that I would never forget. She walked to the door, turned the deadbolt, and dropped the key into her pocket. Nobody leaves until she admits she's faking, she said with a sickening smile, as if she held all the power, as if we were nothing more than an inconvenience. My head was spinning, my body was no longer mine. It was a wild, thrashing mess of muscles jerking uncontrollably. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear my own ragged breath. My vision dimmed, and the last thing I remember was seeing the terrified faces of my classmates, kids who'd never seen me like this, kids who didn't know what was happening, kids who didn't understand that I wasn't faking. But Miss Blackwood, the one person who was supposed to help, she stood there eating an apple, watching us die. I had always believed my family was perfect. At least that's what I wanted to believe. We had the kind of family that took pictures at every holiday, smiling and looking like the cover of a magazine. Mom, dad, my older brother, everything was perfect, or at least I thought it was. We had the perfect house in the perfect neighborhood, and I had the perfect parents. Dad worked hard, came home every night, and spent weekends taking me into the park. Mom cooked dinner every evening, always made sure we were taken care of, always put a smile on her face even when she was tired. And he was the perfect older brother, straight A student, star athlete, everyone's golden child. I used to believe I was the lucky one. After all, I got a lot of attention from them because of my epilepsy. It wasn't the kind of attention I wanted, but it was attention. At least that's what I told myself. They cared, right? As I grew older, I started to notice the cracks in the perfect family image. At first, I didn't want to see them. It was easier to pretend everything was fine, easier to bury the doubts deep down where they couldn't get to me. But the cracks were there, small at first. The way my brother sometimes rolled his eyes when I needed help with something. The way Mom and Dad would whisper about my condition behind closed doors, worrying that it was holding me back. And he would make little comments, nothing too harsh, but just enough to make me feel like I wasn't measuring up to him. Not everyone has epilepsy, you know, he'd say, like it was something I could control. I remember the first time I made a comment like that. I was 13, sitting in the living room, trying to finish some homework when he said it. You're not the only one with problems, you know. Some of us just have to deal with things without making a scene. The time I thought he was just being a typical older brother, annoyed, dismissive, maybe even a little jealous. But as I grew older, I began to wonder, did he really think I was faking? Did he think I wanted attention? After all, I'd heard the way people talked about epilepsy behind my back, how it was just a phase, or how everyone's got a diagnosis these days. Was secretly one of those people. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, he said something that shook me to my core. One night, when I was recovering from a particularly bad seizure, he told me, you only do it for the sympathy. You're not really sick, you just want people to feel sorry for you. That moment broke me because I realized he didn't see me as someone sick, someone who needed help. He saw me as a problem, something to be hidden, something to be ignored. And that was the truth of it, wasn't it? The truth that I couldn't escape no matter how hard I tried. I wasn't just the kid with epilepsy. I was the kid who didn't quite belong, even in my own family. When Miss Blackwood locked the door and stood there watching me and David writhe on the floor, I realized something. No one was going to help us, not my teacher, not the adults who were supposed to protect us, and maybe not even my family. I had been hoping for so long that they would see me, see my struggle, see the real me, but all I could feel in that moment was the weight of their silence. It was as if in that room I didn't matter. And what hurt the most, I was beginning to believe it. The next few days after that classroom incident felt like I was living in a haze. My body was still recovering from the seizure, but my mind was in turmoil. The more I thought about it, the more everything from that day seemed like a blur of flashing lights and voices I could barely hear. What kept ringing loud and clear, though, was Miss Blackwood's smug indifference and the fact that nobody seemed to care, not even my family. I could still feel the weight of the door locked behind me, the key in her pocket as if she was somehow in control of our lives. It was as if my epilepsy had become nothing more than an inconvenience to her, and I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, deep down, she was the only one who saw me that way. Wasn't always this way, though. There was a time when I thought I could trust my family, when I thought they saw me the way I wanted to be seen, just another person not defined by seizures or illnesses. But over the years, the cracks started to show. Small things at first, small moments that I should have caught but ignored because I didn't want to believe they meant what they truly did. Now, as the world spun around me, I could finally see what I had missed. Was 15 when it hit me, the first sign of something being off. I was at a family dinner with mom and dad, and we were talking about our plans for the upcoming weekend. It was a typical scene going on and on about his grades and his sports achievements, and mom and dad praising him as they always did. But I wasn't paying attention to the conversation. I was too busy focusing on how my hands had started to feel that familiar tingling. It was a small sensation at first, but as I looked around the dinner table, I could see that nobody was paying attention to me. I've been invited to the big debate tournament this weekend, was saying with that cocky smile that made everyone else smile back at him. It's a huge deal, and the coach is expecting big things from me. Mom's face lit up. That's wonderful. You've always been our star. I smiled weakly. That's great. But as they continued to praise him, my thoughts drifted. My hand was starting to tremble now, and I could feel my heart racing a little faster. It was coming. The seizure. I knew it was coming. I'm just feeling a little sick, I muttered, looking down at my plate. I think I should go to my room. Barely glanced at me. Again, you just had one last week. Maybe you're faking it for attention. His words stung, cutting deep into me. He hadn't even looked up from his plate, hadn't even really heard me. But the way he said it, casual, dismissive, made me wonder if he truly believed it. My brother, the golden child, the perfect student, the perfect athlete, did he really think I was faking it? Was this how they all saw me? Didn't say anything. She didn't scold him, didn't defend me. Dad didn't even look up from his phone. They both just kept talking, acting like it was all normal, as if my existence, my condition, didn't matter. Wanted to scream. I wanted to shout at them that I was faking, that it wasn't some drama I was playing out for their attention. But instead, I quietly excused myself from the table and retreated to my room, where I waited for the seizure to pass. It came just like I knew it would, the familiar twisting, the loss of control. But this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was broken, that something inside of me had cracked. Looking back, I realized that the cracks didn't start with that dinner, they had been there for years. The first crack was my brother, always the one in the spotlight. At first, I thought he was just being a typical older brother, competitive, a little cocky, but the more I reflected, the more I realized that his behavior toward me wasn't just sibling rivalry. He resented me. He resented the attention I got from my condition. The fact that I was sick made me special, and he didn't like that. He hated that I got attention from mom and dad because of something that wasn't even my fault. He hated that my health came first sometimes. The more I excelled, the more I felt like I was invisible. Mom and dad were so caught up in his achievements that they forgot to notice me. They celebrated his successes, always praised him for being the perfect son. And when I needed help, when I needed them to see what I was going through, they were always too busy, too preoccupied with life to focus on mine. They didn't understand how it felt to always be second in line, always fighting for scraps of attention while my brother was the golden boy. I remember one night when I was younger asking mom if she could come to one of my doctor's appointments with me. I was nervous, anxious, and I just wanted her there for me, but she was too busy. She had a meeting with a friend. Can't dad go with you? She asked. He'll be free. It was always like that, got everything he wanted while I was left behind to deal with my seizures on my own. At least that's how it felt. That night, I remember lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, wondering if they even cared, wondering if anyone truly understood what I was going through. It wasn't just in my parents, though. The school was no better. In fact, in some ways, it was worse. Miss Blackwood wasn't the first teacher to dismiss my condition, and she was the last. In fact, after that day in music class, I started to realize how much I had been overlooked, how many adults had dismissed my medical needs without a second thought. Teachers, counselors, they all acted like I was some sort of inconvenience, like the epilepsy was just an excuse for attention, just another trend. Remember one time in history class, I was trying to explain my condition to teacher after I'd missed some days due to a particularly bad episode. I handed him the letter from my neurologist, explaining the importance of my seizure action plan, the emergency steps they needed to follow, but the teacher barely looked at it. He handed it back and said, "We don't need any special treatment here." That was it. I was left feeling small, insignificant, like my condition didn't matter to anyone who wasn't directly affected by it. It was the same with the school nurse. Every time I had a seizure at school, I would be sent to the nurse's office, where I'd lie on the cot trying to regain my composure while the nurse would just watch me in silence. No sympathy, no concern, just another kid with a trendy diagnosis. But Miss Blackwood, she was different, and that day in music class, she crossed a line. She wasn't just neglectful, she was cruel, and her cruelty wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a bigger pattern, a pattern of neglect, of silence, of not caring about the kids who needed help the most. Looking back now, I see how the cracks had been building all along, how the world around me had been silently breaking, one ignored plea at a time. The silence of my family, the indifference of the teachers, the dismissive comments from my classmates, it all added up. And it made me wonder, if nobody cared when I was hurting, if nobody cared about my epilepsy, then who was going to fight for me when it mattered most? I didn't have the answer then, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Miss Blackwood or anyone else get away with it. After that day in music class, I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't pretend it didn't happen like everyone else seemed to be doing. The flashing lights, the locked door, Miss Blackwood's smug indifference, it stayed with me, eating at my thoughts. Every day at school after that, I walked through the halls trying to pretend nothing was wrong, but inside I was boiling with anger. How could Miss Blackwood do that? How could she let that happen? And how could nobody stand up for us? I could hear her voice in my head mocking me. Every kid suddenly has epilepsy now, it's trendy. The more I thought about it, the more it burned. But what burned even more was the silence. The silence of the teachers, the silence of my family, the silence of my classmates. It was deafening. I tried to bury it, to focus on anything else, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw David, his body rigid, his face turning blue. I saw myself thrashing uncontrollably on the floor, helpless, while Miss Blackwood stood there doing nothing. I remember the first day I truly started planning. It wasn't even conscious at first, more like a seed of anger planted in my chest, growing into something I couldn't ignore. I'd been trying to focus on my schoolwork, trying to get back to normal, when pulled me aside after class. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice low, "and I'm in." "What are you talking about?" I asked, confused. She glanced around, making sure nobody was eavesdropping. "We can't just let this slide, not after everything that happened. We need to do something. Miss Blackwood needs to be held accountable." I didn't say anything at first, but deep down I knew she was right. I had already been thinking about it, about what I could do, about how I could make people listen. But hearing say it out loud, it gave me the courage I needed. Didn't tell my parents what I was planning. I knew they wouldn't understand. Mom and dad were always preoccupied with life, their golden child, the one who was on track to go to college with a full scholarship, the one who always had his life together. I had always been second place, the sick kid, the one who needed help. I wasn't sure if they even cared enough to hear me out, and besides, I didn't want them to see me as dramatic or making a scene. They'd never take me seriously. But I wasn't going to let it go this time. I had already been through enough. I had been silenced for too long. First step was simple. I started gathering evidence. I knew there had to be something I could use to show how wrong Miss Blackwood had been, how dangerous her actions were. So I started digging, I asked around, I talked to classmates who had been in the room that day. I even found a few who had recorded videos discreetly of the strobe lights flashing and the chaos that ensued. No one knew I was collecting this evidence, but I needed to make sure I had something solid to back up what had happened. It wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about getting revenge on Miss Blackwood. It was about making sure no one else would have to go through what I had. It was about the kids who were afraid to speak up, about those who were too scared to fight back. I couldn't be the only one who cared. Things escalated quickly after that, and I were the ones who organized it. We started a group chat with a few of our friends, people who had seen what happened in that classroom, people who were willing to fight. Everyone was on board. Everyone wanted to make sure Miss Blackwood couldn't do this to anyone else. We began planning the walkout. It was a simple idea, really. We would walk out of class as a group and demand that Miss Blackwood be removed. We were going to get attention, make them listen, and if we had to cause a scene, we would. If the school wouldn't do anything about it, we would make them. I remember the night before the walkout, sitting in my room, feeling the weight of the decision settle on my shoulders. My hands shook as I typed out a message to everyone in the group chat. Tomorrow, we make it happen, no turning back. I had no idea what was going to happen. I didn't know how the school would react or if anyone would actually follow through, but I knew I couldn't back down, not now. The day of the walkout, everything felt like it was building to a breaking point. As the bell rang for third period, I could feel the tension in the air. Was already waiting by the main entrance, the group of students gathered behind her. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't back out now, not when everything had been set in motion. The hallways were filled with students making their way to class, but when I passed by the security guards, I could see the shift in their demeanor. They were watching us closely, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. As soon as I reached the entrance, I turned to face the doors. Was standing in front of them, her arms crossed, a determined look on her face. A few of our friends joined her, and before anyone knew what was happening, we started walking out one by one. "Hey, you can't leave," one of the security guards called after us, his voice demanding, but we didn't stop. We kept walking, all of us, like a wave crashing against the shore. We made it outside to the front lawn and stood there in silence, our backs to the school. Nobody was shouting, nobody was waving signs. We were just standing there together, making a statement without saying a word. Cars driving by honked their horns, some in support, some confused, but the longer we stood there, the more people started to notice. A few teachers stood in their doorways watching, but none of them tried to stop us. Some even gave small nods of approval. It was like they knew what we were doing was right, even if they couldn't say it out loud. The walkout lasted about 20 minutes. No chants, no speeches, just quiet defiance. We knew it wouldn't change everything, but we were making our voices heard. We were demanding that things be different. And we finally filed back inside. There were yellow detention slips waiting for us. Everyone who had participated got one, and I could already feel the consequences weighing down on me. But it didn't matter. We had done something. We had sent a message. The school couldn't ignore us anymore. The silence had been broken. I didn't know it then, but that walkout was just the beginning. It was the first step in a long, painful journey that would force me to confront my family, my friends, and everything I had tried to bury deep down. The consequences came quickly, but the truth always has a way of catching up. The day after the walkout, everything changed. I had expected some fallout, detention slips, angry teachers, a few heated conversations, but what came next was something I couldn't have prepared for. The school's response was swift, but it wasn't the detention or the reprimands that made my stomach twist. It was the cover-up, the way the adults around us tried to spin the narrative into something that wasn't even close to the truth. I had barely sat down at my desk when Principal's voice crackled over the PA system. "Students who participated in yesterday's walkout are to report to the auditorium immediately after third period. Please be aware that this is not a punishment, but a meeting to discuss appropriate school behavior." My hands went cold. The appropriate behavior part felt like a threat, a warning. I exchanged looks with who was sitting beside me. Neither of us said anything, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We had made our stand, but we had no idea what would come of it. When the bell rang, we gathered our things, and a few of the others who had joined us in the walkout made their way toward the auditorium with heavy steps. We weren't being called in for a discussion, I realized. We were being called in for a show. Inside the auditorium, Principal stood at the front, flanked by the school's lawyer and several other administrative staff members. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken judgments. As we filed in, I caught sight of a few teachers sitting on the sidelines, their eyes casting sideways glances toward us. No one spoke. "We're here to discuss yesterday's actions," Principal began, her voice strained and cold. "And while we understand that you may have strong feelings about the events in music class, your behavior disrupted the learning environment and was entirely inappropriate." I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to speak, to say something about what really happened, about the way Miss Blackwood had locked us in, about how none of the adults had cared. But I couldn't, not yet. I had learned over the years that silence often gave me more power than speaking out ever would. They were trying to silence us with their words, but I wasn't going to let it happen again. "While your actions may have been motivated by concern for a classmate," Principal continued, "we ask that you all reflect on the bigger picture. Disruptions like this only hurt the entire school community. You are setting a bad example for your peers." Her words stung. I glanced at whose jaw was clenched. She was trying to hold it together, but I knew she was just as furious as I was. This wasn't about the school or the community. It was about protecting their own image, making sure nothing bad ever got out. I raised my hand, surprising myself. When Principal turned to look at me, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "We didn't do this for tension," I said, my voice breaking with the weight of everything I had been holding in. "We did this because Miss Blackwood locked us in the room and did nothing while some of us were having seizures." The room went quiet. All eyes were on me, some of the teachers looking shocked, others looking guilty. "That's not what happened," the lawyer interjected quickly, standing up. "The actions of the students involved are being blown out of proportion. What we have here is a case of mass hysteria, nothing more." The words hit me like a punch. Mass hysteria, my body went cold. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how wrong he was. How could they dismiss everything that had happened as some weird collective overreaction? It wasn't hysteria, it was real, it was my life. But before I could say anything, the lawyer turned to Principal. "We need to protect the reputation of the school," he said softly, as though I couldn't hear him. "These students are causing trouble, and we need to make sure it doesn't escalate further." I felt like I was choking, my throat closing up as I realized what they were doing. They weren't concerned about the truth, they were concerned about covering their own backs. It wasn't about me or David or anyone else who had been affected by that day. It was about the school's reputation, the image they had worked so hard to maintain. The meeting dragged on for what felt like hours, but every word I heard just pushed me further into a pit of helplessness. The silence of the school, of my family, of the staff had been deafening, but now in that room, their attempt to bury the truth felt louder than ever. It was that night that everything came crashing down. Had gone home after the meeting trying to pretend like I was okay, but I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. I knew my parents hadn't paid much attention to what happened in music class. They had been too busy with their own lives, too focused on achievements to even ask about mine. But after the walkout, I expected something to change. I thought maybe, just maybe, they would really see me for the first time. I was wrong. And I got home, I found sitting at the kitchen table going over some homework. Mom and Dad were at the counter talking about a meeting they'd had at work. They barely acknowledged me when I walked in, and I felt that familiar sting of being invisible. How was school today? Mom asked, glancing up from her phone. It was fine, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Didn't even look up? Must been fun playing the victim again, he muttered under his breath. I pretended I hadn't heard him, but I knew what he meant. He always made little comments like that, dismissing my condition, my struggles. To him, I was just seeking attention. I was about to go to my room when I heard my dad's voice. What's this I hear about a walkout? He asked, his tone not quite angry but distant. I didn't do it for fun, I said, my voice shaking now. We did it because Miss Blackwood almost let us die in that room. Nobody helped us. She didn't even care. There was a long silence, and I could feel the weight of their gaze on me. Finally, Dad sighed and put down his phone. Look, I know you've had some problems with your seizures, he said, but this is a bit much, don't you think? You're making a big deal out of nothing. It was like a punch to the gut. My own father, the man who was supposed to support me, who was supposed to care, was brushing me off, telling me that I was exaggerating. Nobody cares, I said, my voice finally breaking. Nobody ever cares. That was when it hit me. It wasn't just Miss Blackwood who had locked me in that room, it was my family too. They had been locking me in this cage of silence for years, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. They hadn't listened then, and they weren't listening now. And that's when I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for my right to be seen, to be heard, to exist in this world without the constant weight of being ignored. That night as I lay in bed, I made a decision. I was done being silent. I was done letting my family, my school, and everyone else walk all over me. I wasn't going to stop until Miss Blackwood was held accountable. But first, I needed to find a way to make them listen, and that would take everything I had. The truth of it hit me like a wave the next morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to pretend I wasn't still shaking from the argument the night before when I got the call. It was my neurologist's office. The woman on the other end of the phone, her voice steady and professional, told me to come in right away. It wasn't an appointment I'd scheduled, it was urgent. My heart raced as I grabbed my jacket, knowing deep down that something wasn't right. When I arrived at the clinic, the usual antiseptic smell of the waiting room seemed heavier, like the air was filled with the weight of everything I'd been holding in. My hands were clammy, my mind spinning. I was already imagining the worst, imagining more bad news I didn't want to hear. Sat down in the sterile waiting area, the sound of fluorescent lights buzzing above me the only noise in the room. I could feel the tremble in my fingers, the familiar sensation of my body preparing for a fight I didn't want. And I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in that music room, how I had almost lost control, how David had almost died, and how Miss Blackwood had stood by indifferent. Miss Green, please come in, a nurse called, snapping me from my thoughts. I followed her into the examination room, my mind still racing. The doctor entered shortly after, holding a file in her hand, and she didn't waste time. I know you've been under a lot of stress lately, she began, setting the file down in front of me. And I know the seizures have been increasing, but after reviewing your recent tests, I'm afraid I have to tell you that things are more serious than we anticipated. I felt my stomach drop. What do you mean? Pause, glancing at the x-rays in the file before looking back at me. The frequency of your seizures has increased dramatically over the past few weeks, and your brain activity is showing signs of damage. I believe your threshold for seizures is lowered, and it's likely caused by the trauma of the stress you've been under. I want to schedule a series of additional tests, but for now I need to adjust your medication. If the seizures continue at this pace, you could be at risk for something more severe. I didn't hear much after that. The words blurred together as I processed what she was saying. Stress, trauma, this was my life now, all because of what happened that day. The anger built up inside me again. The silence, the dismissal of my condition, the way I had been treated by Miss Blackwood, by the school, and by my own family, all of it had led to this moment. I could feel my body weakening, the seizures becoming more frequent, more unpredictable. I couldn't handle much more of this, and worse, nobody else seemed to care. When I got home, I felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. The doctor's words echoed in my mind, but they were nothing compared to the suffocating silence that followed me everywhere. I had already told about my appointment, and she was the only one who really understood. She was the only one who had been with me through this entire nightmare, yet I still couldn't shake the feeling of being alone. As I walked through the door, the house felt empty. Mom and Dad were gone again, probably caught up in their own busy lives, and was nowhere to be found. I went straight to my room, sitting on my bed, feeling every ounce of exhaustion from the emotional and physical toll. But then my phone buzzed with a message from, they're calling it a mass hysteria incident. Miss Blackwood is still teaching, and they won't even let us talk to the police yet. They're making us look like we're overreacting. The words hit me like a punch. My heart raced as I read her message again. I couldn't believe it. They were still covering it up, still trying to sweep it under the rug. And that's when I decided I had had enough. I went straight to the desk in my room and began pulling out every document I could find. I grabbed my seizure action plan, the letters from my neurologist, and anything else that could prove I wasn't just making things up. I had to show them. I had to prove that this wasn't hysteria. I was the problem. They were. The next few days were a blur of doctor's appointments, frantic phone calls, and frantic attempts to gather evidence. The doctors had recommended adjusting my medication, but even with the increased dosage, the seizures came more frequently. The pressure in my skull was constant, as though my brain was always on the verge of misfiring. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it building like a storm waiting to hit. But the worst part was what came next. I was sitting at my desk when I heard the doorbell ring. It was late, too late for visitors. My pulse quickened, my fingers trembling as I opened the door. Standing there in the dim hallway was a police officer. Miss Green, he asked, his expression unreadable. We need to speak with you. My stomach twisted into a knot. I had no idea what this was about, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. I stepped aside, letting him into the living room. My heart was pounding as he sat down, pulling out a notepad and pen. Your school has filed a report, the officer said, not wasting any time. They claim you and several other students are making false accusations about the incident in music class. They're calling it an exaggeration and overreaction to a minor disruption. We need to ask you some questions. I could feel my chest tightening. They were still trying to bury it. Miss Blackwood, the school, all of them trying to make this about us being out of control instead of taking responsibility for their own negligence. I fought the urge to snap. I had been calm for so long, trying to make everyone else happy, trying to be what they wanted me to be, but this was too much. I'm not making anything up, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I almost died in that room. I wasn't the only one. There's proof, video footage, medical records. You can't just ignore this. The officer nodded, but there was a look of doubt in his eyes. I'm going to need to see that evidence, and until we get that, I can't make any decisions. But right now, all we have is the school's word against yours. You're going to have to prove this wasn't just a misunderstanding. I nodded, my body stiff with frustration. I'll prove it. I'll make sure they can't hide it anymore. As the officer left, I realized that I was at a crossroads. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. I could feel the weight of everything, my health, my fight for justice, and my broken family, all pushing me forward like a freight train. But I couldn't stop now. I had already come too far. I gathered every piece of evidence I could find, videos, medical documents, witness statements from my classmates, and set out to make sure the truth would finally come out. But the path to justice was never as straightforward as I had imagined. There were twists, turns, and obstacles I couldn't have predicted, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I was done being silent. Days after the officer's visit blurred into one another. The pressure was suffocating, the weight of everything I was fighting for justice, truth, the need to be seen bearing down on me harder than ever. My head was constantly buzzing with the strobe lights, the flashing images of that day in music class, David's face blue and frozen, my own body jerking uncontrollably while Miss Blackwood just stood there eating an apple. I couldn't stop seeing it. The more I thought about it, the more I knew that silence wasn't an option anymore. I couldn't let anyone dismiss what happened, couldn't let them walk away with their lies. But the hardest part, it was the battle within my own family. It wasn't just the school that had abandoned me. It wasn't just the teachers or Miss Blackwood. It was the people who were supposed to have my back, the ones who had always told me they loved me, that they would protect me. My parents, my brother, they had turned away when I needed them most. I had always believed that family was supposed to be your safe space, the people who would stand beside you no matter what. But with every passing day, I realized that wasn't true for me, not anymore. I had grown up with the image of a perked family, one where everything was seamless. The perked son, the star athlete, the A-plus student, and then there was me, the sick one. My condition, something I couldn't control, became the thing that separated me from them. It became the silent chasm between us, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I could feel it widening every time I walked into the house. It all came to a head one afternoon when I came home from school, exhausted both physically and emotionally. I had been in the middle of organizing my evidence, trying to keep my mind focused on the facts when I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the words cut through me like a knife. I think we need to talk to about this, Dad said, his voice tight. I know he's been hard on her, but this has gone too far. We can't let her keep doing this. She's making things worse. On's voice was softer, but there was a sharpness to it. I know, but what can we do? We've tried talking to her. We've tried to get her to just calm down, but this walkout, now this police investigation, it's just making everything worse. What will people think of us? What will happen to? He's worked so hard to keep up his image. The words hit me like a punch in the stomach. What will happen to? That's what they were worried about. Not me, not my health, not what Miss Blackwood had done to me and David, but how this would reflect on Spurked life. Could feel my heart breaking all over again. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand gripping the door frame, the tears threatening to spill over. How had I missed it? How had I missed the way they'd always treated me differently? They hadn't cared then, and they weren't going to start caring now. They just wanted to preserve their image, the perfect family image. I turned around, slowly walking back to my room without saying a word. I couldn't let them see how much it hurt. I couldn't let them know that their indifference, their silence had cut me deeper than any of them could understand. The next morning, things were tense. I could feel the coldness in the air as soon as I walked downstairs. Mom and Dad didn't say anything to me, was already sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes glued to his phone. I wanted to scream, to demand they see me, hear me, stop pretending everything was fine, but instead I stayed silent just like I always had. Wasn't until texted me that things began to shift. She told me that she had spoken to a lawyer, a civil rights attorney who had agreed to take our case. The weight of the world seemed to lift off my shoulders just from reading those words. Someone out there actually believed us. Someone wanted to help. It wasn't over yet. The fight was just beginning, but for the first time, I felt like I had someone in my corner who wasn't going to turn their back on me. As then I talked about next steps, something in me snapped. I knew my family wouldn't help me. They wouldn't stand up for me, not the way I needed them to, so I had to do it on my own. I had to be my own voice, my own advocate, and I would fight for justice, no matter who stood beside me. But then something unexpected happened. That night, after everything had quieted down, there was a knock on my bedroom door. I hadn't expected him to come in, let alone say anything. He stood there for a moment, awkwardly, like he wasn't sure what to do. I didn't say anything at first. I couldn't look at him. His presence alone reminded me of everything I was fighting against. He paused, his voice shaky. I'm sorry. I looked up at him, unable to hide my surprise. What do you mean? He took a deep breath. I didn't understand. I didn't get how serious this all was. I just thought you were making a big deal out of nothing, and I was angry. I thought you were just trying to get attention. But now I see it. I see how much you've been through. I'm sorry I didn't get it sooner. I stood up, shocked, unsure of what to say. Was this some kind of twisted apology? Was he just feeling guilty because of the mess we were in now? I don't know what you want me to say, I said, my voice cold. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for your support, for your belief in me. Nodded, his eyes softening. I don't know what I can do to fix things, but I'll stand by you, whatever happens. There was silence between us, a long pause that hung in the air. For the first time in a long while, I felt like my brother might actually be on my side. It wasn't much, it wasn't everything I wanted, but it was something. It was a crack in the wall that had always stood between us. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of a real connection, the beginning of him seeing me for who I was, someone who was more than just her condition. By the time the lawyer we contacted began to build the case, everything seemed to be moving faster than I could handle. We had evidence, we had witness statements, we had video footage from the day of the incident, footage that proved Miss Blackwood had stood by and done nothing. But even with all of this, the road ahead was still filled with obstacles. School was pushing back hard, doing everything they could to make it seem like we were exaggerating, like we were the problem. But now I had something I never thought I would have, my brother finally on my side. I didn't know if he truly understood everything or if he was just feeling guilty about the way he treated me in the past, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I was fighting alone. And for the first time, I had hoped that maybe, just maybe, I could win. The day of the court hearing, I felt like I was stepping into the unknown. Every inch of me wanted to turn back, to forget about all of it and go back to the way things were before. But deep down, I knew I couldn't, not now, not after everything we had been through. There was too much at stake. I had spent countless hours with the lawyer going over every detail, every word, every piece of evidence we had gathered. We had the video footage, the witness statements, medical reports, and my own testimony. The truth was undeniable. Miss Blackwood had failed us. She had locked us in that room, ignored our pleas for help, and done nothing while we suffered. And yet, as I sat in the courtroom, I realized just how much we were up against. The defense hired by the school district was already preparing their argument. They had their own witnesses, their own narrative. They were going to try to convince the jury that what happened in that room was nothing more than a misunderstanding, that we, the students, had exaggerated the events, that we were the ones at fault. I had never been in a courtroom before, and the sterile, cold air only made me feel more out of place. The chairs were uncomfortable, and I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me. Sat beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly, giving me the strength I didn't know I had shown up, sitting in the back row, his eyes fixed on me, nervous but present. For once, I didn't feel entirely alone. The judge entered, and everyone stood, silence filling the room. When we were finally seated, the trial began. Blackwood's defense lawyer stood first, confidently walking to the front, his words flowing like a well-rehearsed script. He tried to paint us as a group of unruly teenagers who had exaggerated the truth for attention. He mentioned how we had been disruptive in class before, how the seizure incident could have been a reaction to stress or panic, and how the walkout was nothing more than an act of rebellion. Every word he said felt like a slap in the face. I sat there clutching the arms of my chair, trying not to let my anger boil over. I wanted to shout. I wanted to scream that they were wrong, that they had no idea what it felt like to be trapped in that room, to be ignored when you were begging for help. But I stayed silent, focusing on the truth. I had to stick to the facts. Then it was my turn. I stood shakily, my heart pounding in my chest as I walked up to the witness stand. I had done this before many times, but this was different. This wasn't just about telling my story, it was about holding someone accountable. It was about making sure that this never happened again. My voice was steady, but inside I was a mess of nerves. Told them everything about the tingling in my fingers, the way my body had betrayed me, the panic in my mind as I begged Miss Blackwood for help. I told them about how she dismissed me, how she locked the door, how she stood there eating an apple while I fought for control of my own body. And I told them about the strobe lights, how they made everything worse, how they triggered a chain reaction of chaos in that classroom. I could feel the eyes of the jury on me, their faces a mix of disbelief and sympathy. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others looked angry, their fists clenched. But the truth was out there now. There was no turning back. When I finished, I returned to my seat, my hands trembling. The defense didn't cross-examine me, but I knew that was only because they had nothing to say. They knew the truth. They just didn't want to admit it. Days that followed the hearing were a blur. It felt like the world was moving in slow motion, every second dragging as I waited for the verdict. I went at therapy more often, trying to manage the increasing frequency of my seizures, trying to figure out how to cope with the emotional fallout. My doctor had told me that the stress of the past few weeks was only making things worse, and I knew she was right, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it go. Every session, I learned new coping techniques, breathing exercises, strategies for dealing with light sensitivity, ways to manage the anxiety that had become my constant companion. The weight of everything I had been through, the isolation, the anger, the fear, it had all been crushing me, but therapy helped. It didn't fix everything, but it helped me breathe again. I also began to see a shift in my relationship with my family, had started to change too. He was there not just physically but emotionally. He would text me after therapy asking how I was feeling. He'd sit with me talking about everything and nothing. For the first time, I felt like we were starting to bridge the gap that had always existed between us. He wasn't the same as he had been before, distant and dismissive. He was trying, and that was all I needed. It wasn't just my parents' mom and dad began to listen, really listen. They apologized for not supporting me sooner. They apologized for the way they had let their concerns about future cloud their judgment. They were trying to make up for the years they had neglected me, and though it couldn't fix the past, it was a start. They were finally seeing me, and it felt like, for the first time in my life, I wasn't just the sick kid anymore. When the verdict finally came in, I was sitting in my room with beside me, my fingers trembling as I stared at my phone screen. The message from our lawyer popped up and my heart stopped. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Miss Blackwood had been fired, the school had been ordered to overhaul its teacher training program, and the district was required to pay a substantial settlement to cover medical costs for the students affected by the incident. It wasn't perfect, it didn't bring David back, it didn't take away the pain of everything I had been through or the scars that would never fully heal, but it was justice, it was a victory. In the weeks that followed, things slowly began to return to normal. It wasn't a perfect normal, nothing would ever be the same, but I started to find peace again. I learned to take control of my own narrative. I kept pushing for better seizure protocols in schools, working with the disability advocacy group I had started. We raised awareness about the importance of proper medical training for teachers, and we spoke out against the stigma surrounding epilepsy and other medical conditions. But more than anything, I learned how to be kind to myself. I learned that my worth wasn't defined by my condition or by the way others saw me. My family had seen me, they had listened, and that, in the end, was what mattered. As I sat on the grass next to David's headstone, I thought about everything that had happened, the fight, the pain, the victories, and the losses. There was no closure, no perfect ending. But in that moment, with sitting beside me and standing a few feet away, I realized something. I had fought for my life, for my truth, and I had finally been heard. And that was enough.